Greetings, class. Today we're going to start on chapter 6, which is how our cells actually harvest chemical energy. So thinking about it, what kind of chemicals are we putting in our body? So think of chemicals as the things that you eat that have the potential to give you energy. So things like carbohydrates, so things like pastas and breads, even sugar, proteins that we find maybe in beans or meat, and then also fats. So even having a bunch of fat in your diet, the healthy kind of fat, is actually really beneficial about making different types of energy. So for this chapter, our main focuses are going to be on something called cellular respiration, and that is the way that our body cells actually take the glucose, which is a sugar that we eat, and converts it into energy. So we're going to go over the different stages of cellular respiration. We're going to go over fermentation, which is a way of making energy without any kind of oxygen being present, and then some connections between our metabolic pathways. All right, let's get started. So cellular respiration, aerobic harvesting of energy. So just in case you're not familiar with any of these words, aerobic means it requires oxygen, and oxygen is O2. Harvesting, so kind of gathering it together, right? And then energy. So our body's main energy currency is a molecule called ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So for this chapter, we're talking about cellular respiration, and in the next chapters, we'll talk about photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is the way that plants use sunlight to make energy, and cellular respiration is the way that our cells use sugar to make energy. So anything that is alive requires energy, typically in the form of food or sunlight. So like for all ecosystems, energy ultimately comes from the sun. So in photosynthesis, so different plants, cyanobacteria, some algae, they actually take this sun energy. It's captured by something called a chloroplast. And these atoms of carbon dioxide, which is CO2, and water, they are rearranged to form things that we actually take into our bodies. So the sugar, also known as glucose, and oxygen. So I'll put glucose plus oxygen, which is O2, right? So these are things that we take into our bodies to actually produce energy and to live. So that's why it's always a good idea to have plants around to help to purify the air, because they take in that carbon dioxide, which is the gas that we breathe out, and it helps to purify it and then, take out that oxygen into our environment. It helps to make sure that our air is nice and clean. So in cellular respiration, sugar, which is that glucose, it's broken down ultimately into carbon dioxide and water. So that's our CO2 and our water. So these are waste products our body actually gets rid of. So we breathe out carbon dioxide, we get rid of it. It is a waste product. It can make our body very acidic. And we also release water. So release water through this process of urination and sweat. All right, so the cell captures some of this released energy to make ATP. If you remember, ATP is our body's main energy currency, so our body's main energy molecule. So here's just a whole breakdown of the ecosystem and how different things work. So let's start with our sunlight. Okay, so sunlight comes down. We'll imagine this is a nice leafy green tree. It hits the chloroplasts and they go through photosynthesis. So photo meaning light, and then synthesis meaning to make something. So using light to make energy and fresh air. Organic molecules plus oxygen. Okay, so we get this going into our mitochondria right here. The mitochondria then converts all that good stuff to energy molecules. And while we are converting that sugar to energy, we also have to release some from our bodies as heat. So it's not a 100% enclosed type of reaction. Typically, when any type of reaction is occurring, energy is always released in the form of heat. Okay. So then after we breathe out that CO2 and we release that water, then the plants kind of take it in again and purify it again. All right, so a whole system, a whole ecosystem. All right, so breathing, so you might have heard the word respiration before, but breathing supplies oxygen for our cells in cellular respiration and removes carbon dioxide. Remember, we breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. So there is a respiration that relates to breathing. And cellular respiration, these are not the same thing. So with breathing respiration, it's the exchange of gases. So the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, whereas cellular respiration is aerobic. So anything that's aerobic means it requires oxygen, and it helps to get energy from the molecules in our food by our cells. So it helps to harvest energy, typically from, we can say, sugars, which are carbohydrates, our proteins, and also the fats that are in our food. All right, so think of respiration as it relates to breathing. So let's say we're breathing in our oxygen, it goes down to the bottom of our lungs and it is exchanged into our tissues and our bloodstream. So anytime we have that sugar in our muscular cells, we are carrying out that cellular respiration. We take kind of that glucose that we've eaten, plus breathing in all the air and producing energy and then releasing that carbon dioxide and water. We then breathe out the CO2 and the H2O is excreted from our skin or our kidneys. All right, so cellular respiration helps to bank or build up energy in the form of ATP. So that's a very important molecule to remember. It is an exergonic reaction, which means that energy is exiting, and typically in the release of heat. Okay, it can produce up to 32 ATP molecules. So remember this, I'm going to put a big giant star for it. Okay, so for every single glucose or sugar molecule that we eat, we're going to make about 32 ATP molecules. All right, so just for example, one more time, here's our sugar. This is our glucose. We have oxygen. At the end of cellular respiration, we then have carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, ATP as energy, and the release of heat from our body systems. All right, so next up, try to think about the way that our body relates to ATP and how much we need, how many things that we do throughout the day, and how much energy that requires. So we have to have a continuous supply of energy even when we're sleeping. So cellular respiration for the human body provides energy and helps us to maintain our voluntary and also involuntary activities. So a balance of energy intake, so energy intake in the form of food, and expenditure, so how much of that energy you're burning through every single day, is required to maintain a healthy weight. So you may have heard of what goes in has to be taken out as well. So trying to burn or use as many energy calories as you've taken in during the day to help maintain weight. Okay, so here are just some examples of activities and how many calories they have the potential of burning per hour. So sitting and writing, so like you're doing maybe right now, studying, writing notes, it actually burns calories. It takes a lot of calories to actually concentrate and to remember things, driving a car, dancing, walking, swimming, bicycling, dancing fast, and then running. Okay, so cells capture energy from electrons. Remember electrons? Those subatomic particles that we have in our atoms, so those negatively charged electrons falling from organic fuels to oxygen. So electrons are removed from fuel sources or molecules, that is called oxidation, and then are transferred to NAD+, which is reduction. So NAD+ is an electron carrier, and so it helps to transport electrons between other molecules. Okay, so NADH passes the electrons to an electron transport chain within the mitochondria, and energy is released as electrons fall from a higher energy to a lower energy space. Because kind of think of falling down maybe a waterfall or maybe just walking down the stairs. So each time an electron goes from a higher energy plane to a lower energy plane, energy is released. Okay, and that energy is harvested to make ATP. Okay, so for example, just looking at this, here's our glucose again, here's our oxygen. So glucose is oxidized, which means it's going to lose hydrogen atoms. Anytime you see this written as H+, we can either say hydrogen or a proton. So same thing, okay? And then oxygen right here is then going to be reduced, which means it's going to gain hydrogen atoms, right? You see that gain of that H right here, 2 of those hydrogens, and then also same thing as electrons, okay? All right, so here's another example of those electrons kind of just tumbling down or kind of falling down. Like I said before, think of that waterfall, maybe walking down the stairs, maybe think of just like rolling one of these marbles or something down the stairs, and each time they descend per stair, it releases energy, okay? So you see how they're going from high to low, energy sources, and we're able to release that energy, and that's what we need to make that ATP. All right, so let's go ahead and go through the different stages of cellular respiration. So the very first stage is something called glycolysis. And anytime you see that beginning gly or glyco, this refers to glucose. Okay, so that's your sugar. And anytime you see this word lysis, it means to split, to burst, to break apart. So we're breaking apart this glucose molecule and we're going to get 2 pyruvates in the end. This occurs in the cytosol of the cell, so that cell juice, right, that has all the different organelles suspended in it. This is the one stage of cellular respiration that does not occur in the mitochondria. It is also the very first step in cellular respiration. So the whole purpose of glycolysis is to break down 1 glucose molecule into 2 molecules of something called pyruvate. So pyruvate are 3 carbon compound molecules. So 1, 2, 3, that's 1 pyruvate. And 1, 2, 3. Whereas glucose is a 6 molecule compound. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And at the end, it's broken down into 2 separate pyruvate molecules that are just 3 carbons each. All right, so stage 2 for your book, we have kind of combined the second and third steps. So pyruvate oxidation, also known as the preparatory reaction or an intermediate reaction. And then we have the citric acid cycle. You might also see it during your studies as the Krebs cycle. Okay, so that's the same thing. These are actually now going to take place in the mitochondria. Remember the mitochondria, those are the powerhouses of the cell. So they're the cells where energy is produced and where the last stages of cellular respiration do occur. So what happens with these next 2 stages, we're going to oxidize pyruvate to a 2 carbon compound. Remember they were 3 carbons, and now they're going to be 2. And then supply the third stage with electrons. And remember those electrons kind of going from those higher energy states to lower produces the energy that we need to make ATP. So this breakdown, this picture shows the 4 stages, or we can say 3 stages of cellular respiration. So stage 1, we have our glycolysis. This occurs in the cytosol. So this is a cell right here, just occurring out here in that cellular juice, where we get that glucose broken down to pyruvate. The pyruvate then travels over to the mitochondria. You see we have it outlined right here. Our mitochondria are powerhouses of the cell, okay? We have our pyruvate oxidation, which releases carbon dioxide. And then we have the citric acid cycle. So this actually goes around 2 times, okay? And you can also see the stages that actually produce ATP. So we get about 2 ATP here for glycolysis, citric acid cycle depending on how many rounds it's gone through. And then we have the most ATP produced here at the last stage, okay? So we have our citric acid cycle. And then at the last stage, we have something called oxidative phosphorylation, which combines the electron transport chain and something called chemiosmosis that we will go over in a second. Okay, so this is our stage 3, that very last stage of the electron transport chain, or I can say cellular respiration. So oxidative phosphorylation, sometimes abbreviated as just OXPHOS, because of course that is a lot easier to say. It involves electron transport, so the electron transport chain, and chemiosmosis. So NADH and FADH2 are electron carriers, so they help to carry electrons. So they carry these electrons down the electron transport chain that are kind of stuck or embedded inside that inner mitochondrial membrane. So if you get a question of where this occurs, we have our inner mitochondrial membrane. So most of the ATP that is produced by cellular respiration is produced in this stage. Okay, the electrons are finally passed to oxygen. So oxygen is the final electron carrier for oxidative phosphorylation. And then oxygen is reduced. Remember, reduction, we are adding in a proton or hydrogen ions, right, with water that we use and then release from our bodies. Okay, so kind of an overall, just going through more in depth for glycolysis. Remember, that's the first stage in cellular respiration. So we do have to have an input of some ATP to get glycolysis started. So we do have to have some energy molecules to get this started. So we have a glucose molecule. Remember that molecule, it's a 6-carbon molecule, and then it's split into 2. And we can say into 2 pyruvates, if you remember that. Pyruvate. Okay, so these 3 carbon molecules or intermediates are oxidized to 2 molecules of pyruvate with a net yield of 2 ATP. And this says net because we had to stick 2 ATP into glycolysis to get it started, and then we produced 4. So it's just a net of 2 ATP, 2 NADH, which are our electron carriers, and 2 pyruvate. So ATP is formed during this glycolysis stage via something called substrate level phosphorylation, and that is when a phosphate group is transferred from an organic molecule to ADP, and ADP is adenosine diphosphate, which means it just has 2 phosphate molecules. So when we do add in that extra phosphate or extra P, we now get ATP, which is our body's main energy molecule. So ATP is adenosine triphosphate, and tri meaning it has 3 phosphates attached. All right, so let's go through some of these, just the basic stages of glycolysis. So we have to have that energy input as ATP, and we have our 6-carbon glucose. Okay, so just going from stage to stage to stage. We have to put in another ATP molecule right here at stage 3. Okay. Oops, let me go back over here. Stage 4, this is the part, or step 4, I should say, where a 6-carbon intermediate splits into 2 3-carbon intermediates, okay? So you see right here, we have our 6-carbon glucose, and now it's being split into 2 of those 3-carbon intermediates that will eventually become our pyruvates. So at the step 5, a redox reaction is going to generate NADH, and redox means reduction and oxidation reactions kind of combined together. And at the end, we get 2 more ATP being produced. Okay, so here's the whole thing all together. So our step 5, we get our 2 ATP produced. Lastly, our steps 6 through 9, ATP and pyruvate are produced. So you see we have 2 ATP produced right here around step 6, and then 2 more ATP produced around step 9. But because we had to use 2 ATP to fuel the reaction, we only get a net yield of 2 ATP. Even though 4 are produced, we had to use 2. So 2 ATP, 2 NADH, which are our electron carriers, so they carry the little electrons on them, and then also 2 pyruvate. So these would be the net yields. Pyruvate. So these are your net yields of glycolysis. Okay. So then these are then fed into the second part and third part and fourth part of cellular respiration. So after our pyruvate is oxidized, the citric acid cycle completes the energy yielding oxidation of organic molecules. And all that to say, the oxidation of pyruvate during our preparatory reaction produces something called acetyl-CoA. And that's going to feed into the citric acid cycle. It releases carbon dioxide, and then we get formation of NADH. Okay, so the citric acid cycle typically occurs 2 times to break down. So when our pyruvate is oxidized to acetyl-CoA, we're going to get 2 acetyl-CoA molecules. So we have to get 2 complete turns of the citric acid cycle. So 1 for each acetyl-CoA molecule. So we're going to add in our acetyl-CoAs. We're going to get 2 carbon dioxides released total. We get 3 NADH produced and then 1 FADH2 produced. So let's take a look of the little cycle. So just like a nice circle, right? We feed in our acetyl-CoA. We released 2 carbon dioxides. We form NADH here, so 3 of those. We get a GTP, which is ATP, and then an FADH2 being produced. All right, so let's take a look. That's a very simplified version. Don't worry about this picture. You do not have to memorize all the different enzymes and things that go in here, but it's showing you step by step what is happening, how the acetyl-CoA, which is just that 2 carbon now, is feeding into the citric acid cycle. We combined the acetyl-CoA plus oxyl acetate to produce citrate, and it kind of just goes through. We have our energy production, and we have different things that are going to be pumped now into the oxidative phosphorylation stage. All right, so just thinking about how this happens, most ATP is produced during that oxidative phosphorylation, or also known as our OX-phos. Okay, so in the mitochondria, electrons that are being held on the NADH and FADH2, they are passed down that electron transport chain that I will show you in a second to oxygen, which is that final electron carrier. And this is important because a lot of questions kind of focus on this. Okay, so final electron carrier or final electron acceptor. And then it picks up H or protons from the environment to form water that is then released as that waste product. So energy released by these redox reactions is used to pump protons into the intermembrane space. So if you remember, mitochondria is a double membraned organelle. So it has 2 layers. So between those 2 layers, we have the intermembrane space. Okay. And this is where those protons are being pumped. So in the last part of oxidative phosphorylation, we have chemiosmosis. So this is when that proton gradient drives protons back through the enzyme complex called ATP synthase in that inner membrane. And this is what helps to make ATP. So let's take a look at what all of this looks like. So let's get oriented to what the picture looks like first. So we have our cytosol, which is outside the mitochondria, right? So that's just like our cell juice. We have our double layer. So here's the first layer, which is the outer mitochondrial membrane. Here is our second layer, which is that inner mitochondrial membrane. And then we have our intermembrane space, which is the space between the 2 membranes. And then on the very, very inside of the mitochondria, we have our mitochondrial matrix, which is right here. Okay, so you see right here on the inner mitochondrial membrane, we have 1, 2, 3 and 4 different proteins. And the last part is the chemiosmotic or ATP synthase kind of setup. So the electron transport chain plus chemiosmosis makes up altogether our oxidative phosphorylation. So the electron transport chain, just like it sounds, these little chains right here, they're made up of proteins. And you see here we have NADH, it's coming in and it's releasing electrons. So this little line right here, releasing electrons that are carried from one protein to another. You see where NADH enters first at that first protein, and FADH does not enter until the second protein here in the electron transport chain. So all in all, if we are using NADH mostly for our electron transport, we're going to get more electrons, more ATP produced at the end, because NADH can carry more electrons than FADH2. Okay, and you see with each of these proteins, they are pumping out protons into this intermembrane space, all the proteins except for this protein simplex 2. Okay, so pumping them out, and you kind of see we have a gradient forming, right? Because we only have one protein, looks like here on the mitochondrial matrix, and then a bunch more in the intermembrane space. And as that concentration gradient, which means there's more on one side than the other, that actually helps to drive this rotor of ATP synthase, which is an enzyme. Anytime you see, let me write this out, anytime you see a word ending in ACE referring to the body, so ASE, so our root, that means it is an enzyme, and enzymes are made out of proteins. So this enzyme is there to kind of pump these protons back down their concentration gradient. And as that pumping occurs, it actually makes ATP to be produced, okay? And then you can see right here at the very end of the electron transport chain, these last electrons are going over to oxygen. We combine it with a hydrogen ion and then get water being released. Okay, so I would say just go to this picture, kind of look at it, maybe kind of write things down, maybe write some steps down, and I promise it will not be too hard to understand just the basics of oxidative phosphorylation. All right, so let's look at some more concepts that scientists have discovered. So mitochondria, so those powerhouse organelles in something called brown fat, can actually burn fuel and produce heat without making ATP. And the importance of brown fat is that it helps to actually burn more fat. So these actually help to produce heat, keeping us warmer, and also we calorie burning. So until recently, scientists just thought that brown fat was only present in babies, you know, to keep them alive, and then kind of disappeared. But we have found out more recently that brown fat does occur or is held within adult humans. Usually there's a bigger percentage of brown fat in more lean people versus more people who may be overweight or even obese. Okay, so just all in all, for a whole review, substrate level phosphorylation that occurs during glycolysis, plus oxidative, glycolysis plus oxidative phosphorylation produces about, and I'll put this, about 32 ATP per every 1 glucose molecule during cellular respiration. All right, last part of the chapter, we're going to talk about what happens if we do not have oxygen present. So fermentation is anaerobic. So anytime you see that prefix an, it usually means without something or lacking something. So this typically occurs in an environment where there is no oxygen or very low oxygen content. So fermentation is a way of harvesting chemical energy or producing ATP that does not require oxygen. So usually for this pathway, we only get about 2 ATP versus 32, right, that occurs when we do have oxygen present. So our muscle cells do this, yeast. So if anyone bakes bread, you put the yeast in there, right? And then certain bacteria produce ATP. So we have glycolysis occurring first. So put glycolysis, okay? And we'll say that we have one pathway that requires oxygen and that's our cellular respiration pathway. And one pathway that does not require oxygen, I'll put a big kind of cross out O2 here, and that's our fermentation reactions. So in situations where maybe we're exercising a lot, we have reduced oxygen. So this is one of the major ways that our body does produce lactate or lactic acid fermentation. So just think if you work out really hard or haven't worked out in a while and you get really, really sore, this is because our body is producing that lactic acid in response to our low oxygen state. This is also how we make alcohol. So beer and, let me go the picture. So beer and wine production, kind of sealing things up, feeding it different yeast and making sure that oxygen content has been pumped out. All right. Last part, let's talk about the metabolic connections between the different pathways. So we might think of food as just, here we go. So we might think of food as just, calories, right? Calories in, calories out. But another way to think of food is that it is our fuel. It helps to fuel all these different types of processes that occur within our bodies. So our major different types of macromolecules that we have for intake are carbohydrates. Remember, so our sucrose, which is just our basic table sugar, all these different things that are starches, so things like potatoes, rice, those are our carbohydrates. So more of the sugary things that might give us a boost of energy. We have fat. So fats you get from animal proteins. You can get these from vegetable oils, butters, saturated fats, even kind of fatty fish. And then lastly, proteins. So proteins are major sources. If you do eat meat, it comes from eating animals, right? Or if you don't eat meat, it can come from things like beans and tofu. So all of these different types can actually make ATP. So not just carbohydrates. We all have that ability. So looking at this last slide, so you see we have carbohydrates, which are broken down to sugars, and then go and make ATP. We have fats. So the major kind of middle molecule is something called acetyl-CoA, and then proteins as well. Okay, so kind of going to the acetyl-CoA as well, kind of being in that intermediate that can be converted to stored fats. All right, so let me know if you have any questions, and remember to take your Chapter 6 quiz below. All right, thanks for watching. Have a great rest of your day.